In a single night, two beautiful, ambitious women lost their lives in a way they never could have imagined. A case shrouded in mystery, filled with unanswered questions and shadows lurking beneath the bright lights of Hollywood. They crossed paths with a man who claimed to be a Hollywood producer, but was truly a ruthless predator. A car without plates, deceitful testimonies, and final frantic calls. But the truth revealed in this case is much larger, and the perpetrators are not just David Pearce. Only here on our channel will you discover the full story from angles you've never seen before. Don't miss out. Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth. Los Angeles, the city of dreams, where the bright lights can mask the darkest secrets. But for two women, Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola, those dreams would quickly turn into a nightmare. On the night of November 12, 2021, Christy, a rising model, and Hilda, a talented architect, were living their lives to the fullest. Little did they know, this night would be their last. They attended a party in West Hollywood, a place where young stars meet, laugh, and dance. It was supposed to be just another night of celebration, but things took a deadly turn. The night was filled with music, ketamine, and the kind of carefree spirit you'd expect from young women in the city. But it didn't take long for things to spiral out of control. After leaving the party, Christy and Hilda were driven to a home owned by a man named David Pearce, a man who would soon become the center of a chilling investigation. David Pearce wasn't just another Hollywood producer. His shady past, tainted with allegations of sexual assault, was something the public hadn't known about until now. As the investigation began, the truth about Pearce and his involvement in the deaths of Christy and Hilda started to come to light. Christy and Hilda's phones were traced to Pearce's apartment. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together, but not without more disturbing revelations. Surveillance footage showed Pearce, along with his roommate Brant Osborne, dropping off the two women at separate hospitals in a black Prius. But there was something unsettling about this act. The car had no license plates. The men wore masks, and when questioned by the police, both Pearce and Osborne's stories kept changing. The case was becoming murkier by the minute. But it wasn't just the missing license plates that raised red flags. Christy's autopsy revealed the deadly cocktail of fentanyl, GHB, and ketamine, drugs that she had likely been given against her will. This wasn't just an overdose. This was something much darker. It was becoming clear, Christy and Hilda didn't just die. They were victims of something far more sinister. As the investigation into the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola deepened, detectives focused their efforts on one key question: who was behind this? The first clue came when they traced Christy's phone to David Pearce's apartment. Pearce, a man with a history of allegations, became the prime suspect. When detectives arrived at Pearce's apartment, they were met with an eerie silence. The lights turned off as they knocked. Pearce and Osborne were stalling, giving the officers the runaround. Pearce denied owning the black Prius that had been used to drop off the victims, and Osborne, his roommate, was changing his story with every question. Pearce wasn't a stranger to controversy. Prior to these deaths, he had a long list of sexual assault allegations against him, some dating back as far as 2014. He had a reputation, one that no one in Hollywood seemed to take seriously until now. Inside the apartment, the evidence was chilling: stripped beds, a washing machine running in the background. But what really stood out to the investigators were the baggies, clear signs of drug use. The presence of drugs linked Pearce directly to the tragedy. It seemed he had been involved in the drug-facilitated assault of these two women. For Christy's family, especially her husband Jan, this discovery was more than just a tragedy. It was a call for justice. Jan and other victims' families were now united in their mission. They couldn't let Pearce get away with this. They were determined to see him face the consequences of his actions. One of Christy's close friends, who had known her since childhood, spoke to reporters. Her voice trembled with grief, but she knew what had happened wasn't an accident. Christy was too careful, too aware of the dangers around her, to take drugs like fentanyl. She believed Christy had been targeted. Text messages and phone records painted a disturbing picture. At 5:30 a.m., Christy and Hilda tried to leave Pearce's apartment. They called an Uber, but when it arrived, they never got in. The car left after only 5 minutes. That was the last known communication from either of them. What happened in that brief window of time? What went so terribly wrong? As detectives pieced together the timeline, the investigation turned darker. Pearce and Osborne weren't just connected to the deaths. They were at the center of a twisted conspiracy, and they were hiding something bigger than anyone had imagined. With mounting evidence and growing public pressure, the case of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola finally reached a critical turning point. The question on everyone's mind: would David Pearce face justice for his role in these deaths? But the road to trial was anything but straightforward. Pearce's defense attorney wasted no time. They tried to paint the narrative that Christy and Hilda's deaths were a tragic accident, a result of recreational drug use gone wrong. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. They had a different story to tell. The prosecutor argued that this wasn't just an accident. No, this was a calculated, ruthless act. Christy and Hilda were lured into a dangerous world by Pearce, who had a long history of exploiting women. He was a predator, and the drugs found in their systems were no accident. They were evidence of a deliberate attempt to incapacitate them. But Pearce's defense attorney wasn't ready to give up. They argued that the drugs were taken willingly by the victims, trying to sow doubt about Pearce's involvement. But this argument seemed weak when faced with the overwhelming evidence that Pearce had orchestrated everything, right down to dropping the women off at separate hospitals, leaving them to die without offering any help. Brant Osborne, Pearce's roommate, also came under scrutiny. His testimony was full of contradictions. He changed his story multiple times, further complicating the case. But what the defense didn't expect was the strength of the victims' families and friends. Jan, Christy's husband, spoke to the press after each trial day. His words were firm, his resolve unwavering. He refused to let Christy's death be swept under the rug. He and the families of other victims were determined to see Pearce held accountable. It wasn't just for Christy or Hilda. It was for every woman Pearce had ever hurt. As the trial continued, the prosecution presented powerful evidence: surveillance footage, Christy's last text messages, the drugs found in their systems. Everything pointed to Pearce's involvement. But still, there was one major obstacle: Pearce's ability to hide in plain sight. Hollywood had protected him for far too long. Outrage spread across the internet. People from all walks of life rallied behind the victims, demanding justice. But the truth was, the case was more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Pearce wasn't the only one with something to hide. And as the trial wore on, more and more secrets came to light. What had begun as a simple case of two women found overdosed would soon reveal a much larger, more disturbing picture of a Hollywood underworld full of deception, lies, and criminal behavior. As the trial continued, the ripple effect of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola's tragic deaths spread far beyond the courtroom. The public, shaken by the details that emerged, rallied for justice. The two young women weren't just victims of a horrific crime. They had become symbols in a larger battle against the exploitation of women in Hollywood. The story of their deaths quickly became a media sensation, and soon public opinion was divided. Some believed Pearce was nothing more than a convenient scapegoat for a system that had long turned a blind eye to Hollywood's darker side. Others saw it as a symbol of the rampant abuse that women faced in the entertainment industry, a toxic underbelly that could no longer be ignored. Social media exploded with outrage as people from all corners of the world expressed their disbelief over the case. Hashtags like Justice for Christy and Hilda trended for days, fueling the fire of public outcry. Activists rallied around the victims' families, urging authorities to take a harder stance on predators like Pearce. For the families of Christy and Hilda, the pain was compounded by the public scrutiny and media attention. Christy's mother, in an emotional interview, spoke of her daughter's bright future that had been snatched away. Christy was more than a model. She was a daughter, a friend, and a soul full of life. This wasn't supposed to happen to her, she said, holding back tears. The investigation didn't stop at the trial. Detectives worked tirelessly to uncover more about Pearce's past, connecting the dots between the victims and their alleged abuser. They uncovered even more women who had come forward with accusations of abuse, some of whom had suffered at the hands of Pearce years before. One former victim, whose identity was withheld for her safety, shared her harrowing story with the public. She described being drugged and assaulted by Pearce at a Hollywood party, much like Christy and Hilda. She had kept quiet for years, fearing retaliation, but after hearing about Christy's death, she knew she had to speak out. Pearce's defense team, meanwhile, fought to distance their client from the growing public backlash. They accused the media of painting Pearce as a monster without due process. But as more victims came forward, and as the evidence piled up, the public's perception of Pearce shifted. What was once a question of whether he was guilty or not became a moral debate over the culture of Hollywood itself. As the trial neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The defense pushed back hard, attempting to cast doubt on the victim's actions and motivations, but the prosecution's case, supported by the growing number of witnesses and the clear evidence of drug-facilitated assault, seemed undeniable. Outside the courtroom, Christy's family, alongside activists, called for systemic changes in how cases involving sexual assault and drug-facilitated crimes were handled. This isn't just about Christy and Hilda. It's about all the women who are vulnerable in a world that silences their voices, Christy's husband Jan declared, his voice resolute. In the end, the story of Christy and Hilda was not just a tale of two young women's tragic deaths. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that the glittering facade of Hollywood hides secrets that demand to be exposed. The fight for justice is not over yet, but with the courage of those who refuse to remain silent, the truth will continue to shine through. The trial of David Pearce reached its climax. After weeks of intense legal arguments, emotional testimonies, and a relentless pursuit of justice, it was time for the jury to decide. Would Pearce be held accountable for the deaths of Christy and Hilda, or would the shadowy world of Hollywood predators allow him to slip away once again? For the families of Christy and Hilda, every moment of this trial had been a painful reminder of their loss. Yet, through their grief, they had come together, stronger than ever, to demand justice, not just for their loved ones, but for all the women who had suffered at the hands of predators like Pearce. Hilda's parents, though thousands of miles away in Mexico, had followed every step of the trial, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their daughter's life had been stolen from them in the most brutal way. Their voices joined with Christy's family, who had fought tirelessly to make sure Pearce could no longer hurt anyone else. David Pearce sat in silence, his fate now in the hands of the jury. He had been accused of not only causing the deaths of Christy and Hilda, but of repeatedly exploiting and drugging women. It was clear that he had crossed a line that society could no longer ignore. As the jury deliberated, they sifted through the mountains of evidence. Pearce's long history of allegations, the shocking surveillance footage, the testimonies from survivors, and the damning toxicology reports. They had all painted a picture of a man who had no regard for life. Pearce had used his position in Hollywood as a means of manipulating and abusing women, and it seemed as though his time had finally run out. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the moment arrived. The jury returned to the courtroom, and the judge called the room to order. The court watched in absolute silence as the verdict was read. Guilty. David Pearce was found guilty of the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that justice had been served, but the loss of two beautiful lives could never be undone. Pearce's defense team could do nothing but watch as the verdict was delivered. Their attempts to cast doubt on the prosecution's case had failed. The truth had come out, and the public had rallied behind the victims. For Christy and Hilda's families, this was a moment of bittersweet victory. They had fought for their loved ones, and now, at last, their voices had been heard. But despite the conviction, their pain was far from over. They would never be able to bring back their daughters, their friends, their sisters. In the weeks that followed, memorials were held across Los Angeles and beyond. People gathered to honor Christy and Hilda's lives, to remember their dreams, and to reflect on the tragedy that had cut their futures short. Christy's husband, Jan, addressed the press shortly after the trial. He spoke about the love he had for his wife and how he had promised her he would always fight for her. This trial wasn't just about justice for Christy. It's for all the women who have been victimized and silenced by people like Pearce, he said. His voice rang with both sadness and determination. The trial of David Pearce may have ended, but the fight for justice continues. Hollywood's underbelly, once hidden from the public eye, is slowly being exposed. And as the city lights of Los Angeles flicker in the distance, one thing is clear. The voices of the victims will no longer be silenced. The conviction of David Pearce was seen by many as a victory, but it also marked the beginning of a much larger conversation, a conversation that Hollywood had avoided for far too long. The case of Christy Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola wasn't just about two young women's tragic deaths. It was about a system that had turned a blind eye to the exploitation and abuse of countless women. In the aftermath, the voices of survivors grew louder. Activists, advocates, and survivors of sexual assault began to call for systemic change, demanding that Hollywood take responsibility for the toxic culture that allowed predators like Pearce to operate freely. Legal experts and advocates for women's rights have long argued that the entertainment industry has been rife with abuse, with too many powerful individuals escaping accountability. The death of Christy and Hilda, tragically, was a catalyst for a much-needed reckoning. But for many, this reckoning was long overdue. In the wake of the trial, lawmakers took action. Several public figures, including state senators and legal experts, pushed for stronger laws regarding drug-facilitated crimes and sexual assault in Hollywood. Their goal, to ensure that no other woman would suffer the same fate as Christy and Hilda. To make sure that Hollywood and the world beyond would no longer harbor predators like Pearce. Protests erupted across the country, with people demanding accountability not only for Pearce, but also for the system that allowed him to thrive. For many, this case symbolized the larger problem of abuse in entertainment and beyond. And while Pearce's conviction was seen as a small victory, the fight for change was far from over. For Christy's and Hilda's families, the loss was immeasurable. Christy's parents, once hopeful and proud of their daughter's career, now had to face the reality that their daughter would never get to live the life she had dreamed of. And Hilda's family, torn between the pride of her accomplishments and the pain of her sudden loss, was left to pick up the pieces. Christy's life had been full of promise. She had just married the love of her life, Jan, and had begun studying interior design, eager to carve out a new path. Hilda, too, had big dreams, dreams of becoming an architect in a city that had promised her everything. But in the end, those dreams were cruelly cut short. Christy and Hilda's story was one of heartbreak, but it was also a story of courage. The courage of a family unwilling to let their loved ones' deaths be forgotten. The courage of a community rising up to demand justice, even when it seemed impossible. And the courage of women everywhere who refused to remain silent any longer. Their deaths were a tragedy, but their legacy, the change they sparked, would echo through the corridors of Hollywood and beyond for years to come. While the trial of David Pearce brought some measure of justice, the fight for truth didn't end there. The conviction of Pearce did not erase the trauma, nor did it undo the damage done to so many lives. For Christy and Hilda's families, the pain would never fully dissipate. But their deaths sparked something much greater, a movement that would carry on in their names. The calls for systemic change continued to grow louder. Women in Hollywood, many of whom had long kept their stories hidden, began to speak out about their own experiences. They refused to let the industry silence them any longer. The truth was coming to light, piece by piece, and the world could no longer turn a blind eye to the abuse that had been allowed to fester for decades. One of the most powerful shifts that came out of Christy and Hilda's deaths was the unity among survivors. Women began to speak out about the abuse they had endured, some for the first time in their lives. Their voices, once silenced, were now a beacon for others, calling for an end to the exploitation and abuse that had plagued Hollywood for far too long. The legal landscape also began to shift. Advocates pushed for new laws aimed at punishing those who prey on vulnerable individuals, particularly in cases of drug-facilitated assault. These laws would not only ensure justice for victims like Christy and Hilda, but would also serve as a deterrent for predators who had long operated with impunity. As other trials began to unfold, the changes in the legal system became more apparent. What had once been overlooked or brushed aside was now being taken seriously. The criminal justice system, once slow to act on these issues, was finally holding those accountable for their actions. But it wasn't just about legal reform, it was about creating a safer space for everyone. Christy and Hilda's story didn't end with Pearce's conviction. It was only the beginning of a larger movement, a movement that continues to fight for justice, safety, and accountability. Their deaths were not in vain. Their legacy lives on in the voices of those who continue to demand change. As we remember Christy and Hilda, we honor not just their lives, but the lives of every woman who has ever been silenced, every woman who has ever suffered in the shadows. The fight is far from over, but with each step, we move closer to a world where justice prevails and where the voices of the victims are never again ignored. The tragic deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales-Arzola shocked not just Hollywood, but the entire world. Two young women, full of dreams, were lured into a nightmare that changed everything. Their story was one of betrayal, manipulation, and most of all, exploitation, hidden behind the glamorous facade of Hollywood. As the trial of David Pearce unfolded, we learned that this was not just the story of a man behind a mask, but of a system that had failed these women. But through their loss, Christy and Hilda's families and friends fought relentlessly to uncover the truth. They didn't just want justice for Christy and Hilda. They wanted to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. David Pearce was found guilty, but the road to justice, though crucial, doesn't end here. The case brought to light a much larger systemic issue that has long been ignored. The culture of silence, the unchecked abuse of power, and the exploitation within an industry that holds far too many secrets. Their deaths were not in vain. They sparked a movement, a call for change that can no longer be ignored. Hollywood, once a symbol of dreams, must now confront its dark side. And with the continued efforts of advocates, survivors, and those who refuse to let their voices be silenced. The fight for justice will continue.
So that's how the crimes end, and if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you want me to do some special crimes in all over the world, comment down below, or you can send us direct through email, and I will see you in all my videos. See ya!